Good afternoon. Welcome to the talk entitled Access Keys Will Kill You Before You Kill the Password. You are in Mandalay Bay EF. If that's not where you intended to be, if you look behind you, there are doors and you can change your location very easily. Your speaker this afternoon is Loic Simon. But before we begin, a few brief notes. First, be sure to stop by the business hall located in Bayside AB during the day and for the welcome reception from 1730 to 1900 tonight. Don't forget, the Black Hat Arsenal is in the Palm Foyer on level 3. And last but not least, join us for the Pony Awards in Mandalay Bay BCD at 1830. Housekeeping note. Thanks for putting your phone on vibrate. Me telling you thank you means that that's a hint you're supposed to do that. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing while you wait for your voicemail to pick it up, because you would never answer your phone in a speaker's talk. If you have questions at the end, look around. There are 6 microphones around, located in the back. If you look around you and locate the microphone nearest you, lights will not light up around on the floor to direct you to the nearest microphone. You have to use your own eyes. If you forget, Loic will repeat the question, but we'd rather have them recorded on the mics. Without further ado, Loic Simon.
Thanks, Ray, for the intro. So welcome everyone to the presentation titled Access Keys Will Kill You Before You Kill the Password. My name is Loic Simon. I'm a principal security engineer with NCC Group. Been doing a lot of AWS-related research as part of my work. Been developing a tool that allows configuration review for AWS environment called Scout2, and I'm also maintaining another GitHub repository called AWS Recipes, and that contains a variety of tools and IAM policies. And a number of those will be talked about during that presentation. So what is that all about? The goal is to present hardening solutions for AWS environments that I've been implementing and recommending to people, and also to demonstrate how accessible those are, even though most of the time I don't see them being implemented and used. We're first going to start with the talking about the security around passwords and access keys in AWS specifically. Then we're going to dig into IAM policies and go through a few of those. And finally, I'll describe a few tools that can be used to improve your security if you're an AWS user. So the security of password and access keys. So what's to understand is that in the traditional data center on-premises world, security looks like that. You have guards everywhere. You have fencing around the data center. You have badges that, and you have fingerprint readers, etc. So you have a lot of physical security around your data and your servers. However, in the cloud, it looks more something like that, where you just go to the gate, give your password, and you're allowed to be in. And once you're in, it's important to understand that the credential gives you access to everything because you're managing your infrastructure via a web app. And so that web app, which is in AWS, the Web Console, gives you access to the stored data, databases, application servers, firewall, logging, monitoring systems, etc. And so it's very important to secure these. So even though the security model for on-premises and cloud are very different, there are strong access controls that exist for cloud. And I'm going to try to talk about some of these today. For example, you can require MFA, enforce short session timeouts, have IP-based restriction to access the APIs, etc. And this talk, I'm mostly going to be talking about requiring MFA consistently in AWS. So when you authenticate with AWS, you essentially interact with 2 different services. The first is called Identity and IAM and Access Management, IAM. It's basically AWS directory where you manage your users and groups. It's also where you implement your access controls via the means of policies. And credentials, IAM credentials are valid until a user either deletes them or rotates them, as opposed to the security token service, which is a service that issues temporary credentials, where you can also actually tie limited privileges to these credentials. And typically the validity goes between 15 minutes and 36 hours. So there are mostly two ways people interact with AWS. It's either via the web console, where you provide your account ID, username, and password, and you have access to the web console. And the other way is via the API, and usually either using the AWS CLI or other tools that rely on the AWS API. And access through those is done using long-lived IAM credentials, basically an access key ID and the secret access key that corresponds to that ID. So if we look at try to compare the security of these two types of credentials, password and access keys, so on the left, I put a few type of potential security issues or security features that exist in both, or like in the traditional and cloud world. And I try to compare the security of both type of credentials. So the use of unique and random values for passwords, it's a maybe. Hopefully your administrators do that. For access keys, it is because AWS generates that for you. Sharing between users, it's a maybe in both cases where passwords and access key may actually be shared between several of your employees. Hard coding in source code, for AWS passwords, it's never the case as far as I can tell, because there's no real good way to actually use your password and interact with the API, so most people don't use these credentials in source code. However, for access keys, it's a really common practice. Storing on Post-it notes, it's a no-no for every type. It's typically AWS administrators tend to be pretty good with that nowadays. Storing in plaintext files does not happen with passwords either. However, for access keys, it is done because that's how access keys are designed to be used. You actually have to write them in a specific file for the AWS SDK to look for these values. As far as rotation goes, you have sometimes users who rotate their passwords. Typically, access keys are not rotated. And as far as enforcing rotation, you actually can do that in AWS via the console. It's just a checkbox that you need to tick. However, for access key, you cannot do that. And the last three values are related to the availability of MFA. In both cases, MFA is available. If you create an MFA token for a particular user, when they log in with their password, MFA is actually enforced and users are required to enter an MFA code. However, it is not the case for using an access key. And finally, is there a way to enforce MFA consistently and easily in AWS? Right now, it's a no for both cases. So the takeaway from that is that usually AWS admins have decent password behaviors. They use password manager and they enable MFA. And access keys are actually the weakest link in your AWS environments. They typically are found everywhere in GitHub, in internally accessible configuration files, files are stored on every single of your devs' laptop because they need that in order to actually do their work. And so what we recommend is that actually you require all human or employees in your company to use MFA, regardless of how they access the API. And so for password-based authentication, you just need to enable MFA, and they will be prompted for an MFA code. However, if they delete that one token from their user configuration, they will be authorized to log in again without MFA. With access key-based authentication, you actually need to create a policy and attach the policy to the user or a group the user belongs to. And using of that policy will actually address the problem above, you could deny them from deleting an MFA device, and so you could prevent the user from bypassing the need to have MFA. So if we compare authentication in AWS once you have MFA, in red is highlighted, I highlighted the part that changed. So for the web console, you need to provide an extra MFA code when you authenticate. And when you use a command line or a third-party tool that reads values from the configuration file, you also need to make a call to the SCS service first, providing your MFA code, and that SCS service will return you a new access key that actually starts with ASIA as opposed to AKIA for long-lived credentials, a new secret access key, and a session token. And those credentials issued by STS, you'll be able to use to access any other service in AWS. So in short, you exchange your long-lived credentials plus your MFA code to receive short-lived credentials, which is how both the console and tools will work once you have MFA in place. So now that I talked about the security of access keys and password, I'm going to talk about the various IAM policies that I recommend to use in order to actually use MFA for your environment. So a quick reminder about policies. A policy is a set of permissions that's defined as a list of statements, and it's written in JSON. A statement is a rule, and it's defined by a number of keys. The most important are down here. First, you have an effect that can be allow or deny. You have an action or a list of action. A resource that is the object that the action applies to. And finally, you have a condition. And what's very interesting is to actually combine the deny effect with a condition, and that's what's going to give you the possibility to enforce MFA in your environment. So as a reminder on how IAM policies are interpreted, for a given user, you start by evaluating all applicable policies, so their user and group policies, and you first look for an explicit deny. So if you have a deny statement for the action that is required, the final decision will be a deny. If you do not have an explicit deny, you'll look for an explicit allow. And if you find one, the user will be allowed to do the action. And finally, if you don't find any deny or allow, the default decision will be a deny. So the first policy will actually use that deny effect. We also deny all actions, and we're going to use two conditions. First, we're going to require that the multi-factor auth age or multi-factor auth present key exists. And then we're going to also set a limit on when the MFA authentication must have happened. Otherwise, the action will be denied. So if you look at that policy, you can see that you have two statements. The first statement up there sets that you deny all actions on all resources if the key multi-factor auth age is not present. And the second statement has a requirement on the numeric value of that key. And in that case, it says that if the age of the authentication was older than 8 hours, you will also deny all actions. And by taking that action, that policy, and applying it to users, you can achieve MFA-protected API access in your environment. So how to use that policy? I like to recommend the use of category groups. And by category groups, I mean this type of example, all users, all human users, or service users. And so in that particular case, you want to enforce MFA for all human users, which means any IAM user associated with a person, either an employee or a contractor, that works for you in your environment. So you're going to create that all human user group, place all your IAM users in that group, and attach the policy to this group. Unfortunately, if you do that, you're going to be locked out, or most of your users will be locked out because it's going to be a very strict policy. Many of your users may not have configured MFA already properly, so unfortunately, deploying MFA-protected API access is a sort of requires a slower type of work. So that policy works, but as I said, it may be too restricted for some AWS users. One of the drawbacks is that with that particular policy, all IAM management, all management of credentials has to be done by users who have IAM admin permissions. And the credentials are generated on a limited number of machines, which correspond to the machines used by these IAM administrators. So you end up with a single point of failure here where your IAM admins actually become a very valid target for a potential attacker. So as a suggestion for a better workflow, we recommend to work as is, which is an IAM admin creates a new user, they generate a temporary password for them, and share it using their favorite messaging technology. The user connects to the web console and is required to change their password. They then enroll with MFA on their own. And they cannot actually access any other service or any other action than the change password and the enable MFA actions until they authenticate with MFA. So they will, on the first time they use the console, they will actually have to log out and log back in order to gain access to the rest of your environment. And so that provides advantages that your administrators actually never know your users' credentials. And you also lower their workload because users can manage their own credentials now. So in order to get that better workflow in place, you need two new policies. The first one will allow users to manage their own credentials. And you need to make sure that it's only valid for them. And the third policy is a policy that enforces MFA, but it's going to be slightly looser than before because we're not going to be denying every single action. We're going to allow the change password and the enable MFA action so that they can do that before MFA is in place. So the second policy to allow credential management, here you can see several things. First of all, you see that the resource now is using a variable, the $, followed by AWS username. And that means that all the above actions can only be performed on the user that is currently logged in. We have two different resources because MFA virtual devices are managed under MFA/, and users are managed under user/. So depending on the action, for MFA devices, you're going to have MFA/ as a resource, and for users, you're going to have user/ for the resource. For users, we authorize them to do all action for the access keys, all action on passwords, all action on MFA devices, and on their login profile. And we also allow them to create and delete virtual MFA devices. Yeah, for readability, I use wildcards, but in practice, I actually recommend to explicitly listing all actions so that you don't have a bad surprise where you realize that a particular sensitive or dangerous actions was authorized without you realizing that. So the third policy, which is the new version of the enforcement of MFA, still uses the deny effect. However, now we use a not action key as opposed to the action. And what that means is that we deny every action except those. And so we still have the same two conditions, the existence of MFA and the maximum age of 8 hours. And now we do have a list of actions that we allow to bypass the MFA requirement for. So if we have a closer look at the list of not actions, here is a breakdown of how that works. You have the change password action, which allows to change the temporary password upon the first login. You then allow MFA enrollment, allowing the create virtual MFA device and the enable MFA device. For convenience, depending on whether you work with CLI or the web console, you're going to need some extra actions that are authorized. You're going to either need the IAM get user so that you know what the username is, Or if you work via the web console, you're going to have to authorize users to list users, list existing MFA devices, and list virtual MFA devices. So that policy works as a trust on first use security scheme where you require that exchanging that one temporary password, you hope that it's secure and then the user changes it right away. And once this is done, you have trust that the user actually chose a strong password and also enabled MFA. To prevent the fact that a user may disable the MFA requirement, actually you forbid users from deleting and disabling MFA devices. That's a pretty infrequent request, so we recommend that IAM admins do that instead of users. And by doing that, you actually get to a point where if a given user's session was compromised, the attacker would not be able to delete the MFA device, create a new one, and then gain access to the user's MFA device, or like the new seed that is used to generate the MFA code, because that will never be authorized to be reset by the user itself. So as far as tools goes, I'm going to be talking through 3 different tools. The first one is a command line tool that created to enable MFA. You can have it by cloning that AWS recipes repo from GitHub. And if you just run the AWS IAM enable MFA tool, giving the profile that you want to use, it's going to first create a new MFA device making a couple of calls to AWS. Then it's going to display the QR code in the console or in the browser, depending on the user's laptop configuration. It's going to then prompt for 2 consecutive codes to enable MFA, which is what AWS requires. And finally, it's going to save the MFA serial device in the local configuration file. So if you were to look at your local configuration file before and after you run that, you will see that there's a new key that is created into the .aws/credentials file. It's called AWS MFA Serial. This value is not standard. It's not supported by the AWS SDK, but adding that over there makes it really helpful for running calls to SCS afterwards. So now that you enabled MFA for your users, you want to allow them to easily initiate SCS sessions and configure their local laptop to actually use the SCS credentials as opposed to the long-lived credential that cannot do anything. So you're going to run this tool that is called Need SCS Session, providing your profile name as well. And what it's going to do is going to prompt you for an MFA code, and it's going to send a request that was signed using your secret key, your access key ID, and it's going to also contain your MFA serial number and that MFA code to the SCS API. SCS will return new credentials if everything's valid, and the tool is going to save those into your local .aws/credentials file. So if we look at the changes here, it's a lot bigger than before. And the way it works is that the initial long-lived credentials have been moved to a newly named profile called the original profile name -no MFA. And all the SCS credentials have been stored under the original profile name. So now you have the new access key ID, the new secret key, and the AWS session token as well. And now that you have this, if you were to run any call to the AWS APIs that you have access to, for example, the AWS API CLI will fetch the SCS credentials and use these to sign requests, and everything will work fine because your SCS credentials are valid. And it's going to be good until the 8-hour threshold that you set in your users policy to start denying actions again. So, as I said, there are 2 profiles now, one that contains the long-lived credentials and one that has the SCS credentials. The tool is smart enough to know that if you need to renew your session, it's going to use the long-lived credentials stored under the -no MFA. And if necessary, if you need to make any sort of calls using these long-lived credentials, they are accessible using the -no MFA profile now. And the final tool that I want to talk is not entirely related to MFA, but it's related to one of the security gaps that I mentioned earlier with access keys, the fact that they're pretty much never rotated. So I created a third tool that's called RotateMyKey. And what happens is that when you run that tool, it basically makes a call to AWS, creates a new key, stores it in your file, and deletes the old key that you used to have. In the event that you had MFA enabled, it's actually going to verify that the new key is valid. It's going to prompt you for an MFA code, receive new SCS tokens, and use this token to delete the previous key to make sure that your account still only has one key and that next time you want to run that tool, it's going to work fine. So if we were to look at the .aws/credentials file after that, you can see that, so in that case, I had MFA enabled, so the long-lived credentials under the access key ID and the secret access key have changed. And you can also see that the new, actually the new key ID and the new secret access key under the short-lived credentials have been changed as well. So as takeaways from that talk, I'd like to highlight that in AWS environment, access keys are the root cause for many, if not most, incidents. So it's very important to understand that even though you have users that are well educated regarding the security around passwords, they do have plaintext credentials stored on their laptops. And that's most of the time overlooked by many users in AWS. It's important to know that you can actually enforce MFA for both API and web console access. And you can do that using the powerful deny statements and creating special policies. And there are also tools that exist to allow seamless work when working with MFA enforced API access in AWS. So that's it for this talk. And do you have any questions? Yeah. So the question is, do the users have access to rotating their key, and are they challenged prior to that? If you attach that one policy that allows them to create and delete keys, they will be authorized to do that. It depends on what privileges you give to the user. As far as being challenged before that, they are not. If you enable MFA and run that one tool, it will prompt you for an MFA code to validate the new key, but they are not challenged. They will, if you have a valid SCS sessions, they will be authorized to rotate their key. If they did not initiate an SCS session before and you required MFA, they will be denied because the credentials used to rotate their key will not meet the requirements that you require MFA API access. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. So the question is, can you do MFA, or can you work with that with service accounts that are used by or configured on machines where there's nobody to actually enter an MFA code or do any sort of periodic work? You cannot. The right way to do that in AWS, if you run code on an EC2 instance, is to attach an IAM role to that instance. And by doing that, the instance will be provided with valid STS credentials automatically. AWS does that for you. So what you need to do then is just use an SDK that knows where to read the STS credentials on an EC2 instance. Most SDK do nowadays, as long as you use an up-to-date version. And you will actually have no management to do. AWS will create these credentials for you and rotate them periodically for you. So the instance will always have valid credentials that you don't need to configure, rotate, or anything. Yeah. Anything else? All right, well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so I've actually seen people do that, where calls that they deem less sensitive are required to have a requirement that is 8, 10, 12 hours. And for example, creating a new IAM policy or attaching a new IAM policy to a user require the user to be authenticated within the last 3 hours. Or if you were really paranoid, you could say that any change in IAM, especially creating or attaching policies, has to be done with a re-authentication that is within the last 5, 10, 15 minutes, depending on how paranoid you are, and I guess how often you need to do these changes to make sure that it does not become like too overwhelming for whoever is in charge of that. So to set that on a per action, you would have to either have a larger policy with 2 different statements, and each statement would have different actions and a different condition. Or you could also create separate smaller policies and have one policy that says sensitive actions, and in that case you would set the requirement to be smaller. Yep. All right. Well, thanks a lot, and have a good rest of your day.